Welcome to this Microsoft Excel 2010 Office Productivity Workshop. This workshop was originally presented during the Delgado Community College Summer Institute during the summer of 2012. It was presented on the North Shore at the Covington site. The workshop is split into two workshops. Workshop 1 covers the review of spreadsheet basics, and Workshop 2 covers more advanced spreadsheet management techniques. I think both workshops will be helpful to anyone who is looking to improve their use of Excel. The review of the spreadsheet basics might be a little too basic for those who use Excel on a daily basis, but if you're looking to get started with Excel or just get a refresher or even learn some things that may make your use of Excel a little bit easier, I think you'll get something out of Workshop 1. Workshop 2 will continue with using some common functions and some features of Excel that are considered to be more advanced, things like pivot tables, and also using some functions that are not used a lot, things like lookup functions. And so that will be Workshop 2. So in Workshop 1, we'll be reviewing the basic interface, the window that you see when you open up Excel. We'll be looking at some techniques for data entry and formatting of data once you do get it entered. And then we'll also take a look at entering formulas and functions and some basic formulas and functions that would be commonly used in our setting at Delgado. Also enhancing spreadsheets with graphics and charts, and then finally printing. We'll take a look at the ribbon, the groups and the tabs found on the ribbon, and then what happens when you have a particular object like a picture or a shape. A contextual tab that appears will allow you to make changes to that, so we'll look at that. We'll take a look at the quick access toolbar that you can customize to add buttons that you more frequently use. We'll look at modifying columns, rows, and cells, changing their widths and heights, moving them around, things like that. We'll take a look at the formula bar, the name box, the quick size buttons. All of you are familiar with the buttons in the upper right corner of Microsoft Windows, the close button, the maximize, restore down button, and the minimize button. That's what that means, the quick size buttons. We'll take a look at getting help in the system, and also take a look at zooming. In order to take a look at the Excel interface, I'm going to exit out of PowerPoint for just a moment. I'll get into Excel from the Start menu. If you take a look at the button on the lower left corner of your screen, you'll open up the Start menu, and you may have Excel pinned to the Start menu. If you have it specifically in that list, you can just select it. If not, you can look under All Programs and look for Microsoft Office in your groups, and then you should find it in the Microsoft Office group. When you click on Excel, it should open up a new blank worksheet or workbook. And actually, this is an interesting situation, the way our workbook has opened up. Remember, I mentioned to you the quick size buttons, the minimize, maximize, and close buttons. Well, those are located here in the upper right corner, and these particular ones in this far upper right corner are for the Excel program itself. Notice though that I have this little window that's floating in the middle, and this is an issue that comes up with students occasionally, so I thought it would be a good thing to bring up. This window is entitled Book 1, so it is actually the workbook that we're working in, and it has its own set of quick size buttons. It has a minimize, maximize, and close button as well. So I'm going to click the maximize button here, and notice how the format of the workbook changes. It has filled out the Excel window, Book 1 now shows up in the title bar. So also on the title bar is the Quick Access Tool button, and the default location for this Quick Access toolbar is where it is in the upper right corner. But if I click my Customize Quick Access toolbar, I can change the location. I can show it below the ribbon, and I can also add buttons to it. And this would be used for frequently used tasks. Right now I only have the Save button and the Undo and Redo button, but you might want to add a new File New button, or File Open button, or Print button, or something like that. It would depend on the tasks that you use frequently. The ribbon consists of all of the different tabs you see here. Right now the Home tab is in the front, and it contains all of the formatting options. It also contains the clipboard options and the editing options for finding information, and also sorting and filtering. The File tab, which is actually the first tab, replaces the Office button in the 2007 version. So if you're working with the Office 2007 version, you will have that Office button, which is kind of the circular grouping of little rounded squares in the upper right corner. And that would have basically the same options that you see here. They're called the universal options, things like saving, opening, printing, and those types of functions. On the Insert tab, you can insert certain objects like pictures and clip arts and shapes, and also charts. Office 2010 has something new called Sparklines that we won't cover, but you can insert things like hyperlinks, text boxes, word art, symbols, all of those things on the Insert tab. Page Layout will allow you to change the looks of your printing setup in the page setup area, changing it from landscape to portrait, or changing the margins of the printed page, things like that. Setting up a print area. Scaling it to fit, which is very useful if you have something that's just too big to fit on one page, or you want to get it smaller, but you don't want to have to change the font size of everything, and you want it to fit on fewer pages, so you can scale it down to fit on a certain number on one page, or either just scale it down by 50% or 10% or something like that. Formulas will allow us to look through a library of functions and formulas that are already set up. We'll talk a little bit about manually entering formulas and functions, but this is a good area for looking up something that you're not quite sure of. Data is for importing and exporting, filtering and sorting, lots of data manipulation, changing text to columns. Let's say you have a comma-separated values file and you want to convert it into columns. You can do that with this. The Review tab will allow you to check spelling, open up reference materials under the research area, dictionaries, thesaurus, encyclopedia, stock quotes, all kinds of things. And then there's a specific button for the thesaurus. And then finally, the View button will allow us to change what the screen looks like, do things like zoom in and out, arrange all our panes in a cascading or tiled view so that we can see multiple workbooks at one time. Freeze panes so that we can scroll through data while keeping, say, a column of names on the right side, on the left side, as we scroll to the right to see, say, a grade or something in a column that's not visible on the screen. So that's the ribbon. The Home tab is probably the most used tab on the ribbon. Moving down a little bit, first of all, let's take a look at the organization of the workspace. You probably already know that Excel is organized into columns and rows. Each column is labeled with a letter of the alphabet, and each row is labeled with a number. The intersection of one of these columns and rows, for instance, if I click where column C intersects with row 3, I will be choosing a cell. I'll be selecting a cell, and that cell's name is made up of the column and row that are used to create it, which is column C and row 3. So the cell's reference is C3. That reference of C3 shows up in this area called the name box. So you can see where you are, what you have selected. I'm going to use that zoom function that we saw before, and a very convenient way to zoom is in this lower right hand corner. Right now we're zoomed at 100%. I'm going to zoom up just a bit more so that you can see a little bit more clearly in the video what I'm doing. What I've done is selected C3. So C3 is now considered the active cell. When I type something, I'm going to use the keyboard just to type my first name. When I type something in that active cell, I see this blinking insertion point appear as I'm editing the cell. And I also see what I have typed in that cell up here in this white box above the columns. This area is called the formula bar, and it shows the contents of any cell. You'll also see that some buttons have appeared here that allow me to either cancel what I have typed in the cell at this point or finalize it by entering it. I can also press the enter key, but for now I'm going to click this enter button here, and that gets rid of that blinking insertion point for one thing, and it also finalizes what I have entered. Now I can always go back and edit what I have put in that cell, and one of the ways I can do that is to click in the formula bar and backspace or make changes. This time I'll hit the enter key, and you'll notice the difference between when I click the check mark and when I press the enter key is that the active cell border moved, whereas when I clicked the enter button before, the active cell border did not move. I edited before by using the formula bar. Another way to edit is to double click the cell that you want to edit. So I'm going to double click C3, and I am now, I've got the blinking insertion point, and I can move around in that cell. And this time I'll click the check mark again. Now this looks kind of funny. I typed everything in cell C3, but notice how it's spilling over into cells D3 and E3. That's just a visual effect because everything is in C3, and I can verify that by taking a look at the formula bar. When C3 is the active cell, what shows up in C3, or what the contents of cell C3 are, show up in this formula bar. If I click in cell D3, where it looks like community, part of the word community is, and I take a look at the formula bar, there is nothing. So that confirms that there actually is nothing in cell D3. Same thing for cell E3. Now let me click on cell D3 and put something in there. Well, that sure changes things a bit. Let me click away from the whole thing. Notice that when I typed in cell C3, and when I click there, you'll see it's still there because I can check in the formula bar, but it is not visible anymore. That's because D3 has something in it now, Excel Workshop, and so it is showing up. Now I can put something in E3, and now I'm cutting off cell D3. Not a problem, this is just a formatting issue. It means that we need to make the widths of these columns wider if we want to see the data. And so we'll do that. We'll make C3, or column C, wider by placing our mouse in between C and D. Notice the double-headed arrow appears. I'm going to hold down the left mouse button as I drag a bit to the right. That's not quite big enough. Just a little bit too big. I'll drag back to the left. And so I've made C3 column C wide enough to hold Delgado Community College. Another way to change the width of a column is to do the same thing, find the border between the two, the border to the right of the column that we want to change. And this time I'm going to double click. I'm not going to drag it all. I'm just going to double click while I'm touching that border. And it automatically will do something called an auto fit on the column so that the data or the column will be wide enough to display the data. I'll scroll over a little bit. Well, this column is just a little bit too wide, so I'll manually drag that column over. Another thing that you can do, if you notice as you're dragging, you see the numeric value of the column width. I can change that column width numerically also. If I right click on the column that I want to change, for instance column E, I will get a shortcut menu that includes column width as an option. If I click on column width, I'll see that that column width is now 7.86. I want to make it a little bit smaller, so I'm just going to type in a 6 and click OK. And so the width of my column has changed. Just like we can do column width, we can also do row heights in a similar way. If I want to increase the width of column of row 3, I can place my mouse in between the border between 3 and 4. I get the same double-headed arrow. Of course, it's in the opposite orientation, but I can drag now up and down to change the height of row 3. I can also double-click on the border below row 3 and do an auto fit, and I can also right-click on row 3, get the row height option, and it says 15. I'm going to change it to 40 just so we can see a big difference, and I can change the row height that way. Okay, so let's enter some more data. Let's start off at cell A1. So I'll click in cell A1, make that the active cell, and I will just, again, I'll put in my first name, and I'll hit the enter key, and I will put in the month of the year, and I'll hit the enter key again. This time I will put in a numeric value, put in 500, and then maybe a numeric value with decimals, 1250, and then finally maybe a date. We'll put in a date that's not today, so it won't automatically try to enter it for us. Okay, so I just keyed all of those things in and pressed enter. All of these items of data that I entered have a generic format that has been used when I entered it. But one of the things that we do in Excel is change the format of data depending on how we want to present it. So in the case of just a text value like my name, if I select the cell that I want by clicking on it, I can do things like change the font. I'll change it to something very obvious. So I'll change it to something very obviously different. And I could change the size. And let's go to a numeric value. Let's say here in A3, I want this to be a dollar value, or be recognized like a dollar value. The number formatting area on the Home tab is where I would do this. And right now it's just a general number. I could click this arrow here and change it to currency or counting. Both of those have dollar signs on them. And I could also use the buttons here on in the number group, one of which is a big dollar sign. That's for it to default to the accounting number format. So I'll choose that one. Notice there are some other formats that we'll talk about in just a little bit that this comma style format specifically is a currency format without a dollar sign. So if I click that, you'll notice that the dollar sign goes away, but sometimes that's the way we represent dollars and cents. Another numeric format, the percentage. Let's change this 12.4 in cell A4 to be a percent value. We can use the button here in the number group. Now, because that was 12.5, it multiplied that number by 100 to show it as a percent value. If I wanted a realistic percentage, I need to change that value. Let me change it back to general, and I'll change this number to have the decimal place in front of the 1. So it's 0.125, which would be the same thing as 12.5%, and that's the way we'd want to represent it. So now when I apply the format, finish that off, when I apply the format as a percent, it shows up as well as 13%. Now, that's very interesting too, because it's rounded it to the nearest whole number. These other buttons on this number group talk about increasing and decreasing decimals. So basically, they change what's shown, or the rounding amount of the value. So if I click increase decimal, it's going to show me one more decimal place, and that will show me the 12.5. And if I click it one more time, it's just going to show me a 0 because there are no more decimal places. But I can go in the opposite direction when I want to round. I want to take away decimal places, and I'm not just chopping them off, I'm actually rounding them. That's why I get 13 instead of just 12 when I decrease the decimals. So even though I'm taking that 0.5 away, it's including it in the rounding calculation, so it makes it the 13%. Finally, dates. You notice that I actually typed in May, comma, 21st, or May space 21st, comma, 2012, and it formatted it in this day, month, year format. Well, there are other formats, and we could go to this same box that we did before, the short date and long date. We could do that. Those are default date formats, but I want to show you another area for formatting data, and we could do all of the formatting this way. On each of these groups, there is a small arrow. On most of the groups, there's a small arrow. This is the dialog launcher button, and that will launch a dialog box that's associated with the buttons in that group. This is the Format Cells dialog box. You can see that it has several tabs, and the number tab for formatting numbers is here in front. If I click the category of date, I'll see all of the different formats for a date that I can choose, and I'll just choose a plain old month, or day, month, day, year, and click OK. That will format my date in that way. So these are just ways you can format the data, change the way it looks on the worksheet. You're not actually changing the contents of anything or the way that Excel stores it, just changing the way it displays. Now that we've entered several kinds of data into our worksheet, let's do some other interesting things to it. We've been using the pointer to select individual cells, and you should notice that whenever you select an individual cell, you'll see this dark border appear around that cell, making it known as the active cell. We can also use the selection pointer, and you'll notice it's in a block plus format. We can use it to select a range of cells or a rectangular grouping of cells. So let's say I want to select the cells starting with cell A1 all the way down to cell E5. Well, I start in one or other of those corners. I'll start in corner A1, hold down my left mouse button, drag over to E, and then down to row 5. By doing this, I've selected an entire range of cells, beginning with cell A1 and ending with cell E5 in the lower right corner. And you'll notice that the border now appears around this entire grouping or range of cells. We would note this with a notation called A1 colon E5. That is how we would name this, and you would see this in documentation if you were working on an exercise and they ask you to select, for instance, this particular range, and that's how you know which cells to select. The colon indicates that all the cells in between A1 and E5 are included in the range. So the selection pointer, or this block plus pointer that you see now, is used to select individual cells or a range of cells. And again, to select a range of cells, you want to hold down the left mouse button as you drag across the cells. You also can select a range by clicking the upper left corner of the range, holding down the shift key, and then also clicking the lower right corner of the range. And that keeps you from having to drag. It's just another technique to select. Alrighty, so the pointer can be used to select. It can also be used to do something we call fill. Filling is basically like copying. So let's say I want to copy my name. First of all, let me make the column a little bit wider, and I will select A1 that contains my name, and in order to use the fill process, we need to find the little tiny square in the lower right corner of this active border, this active cell border. And when you place your mouse on that corner, the little square in the bottom right corner, it will turn into a thin plus sign. Notice how it changes. When you have found that, it's actually called the fill handle that you're selecting when you have found it with your pointer. Hold down your left mouse button and drag either down or across. And what you're doing is copying the data from the original cell into the adjacent cells. So it copied my name over and over again into cells B1, C1, and D1. Now, let's take a look at July and do that with July. Now, July is a little bit different from a name. Your name is just a random set of characters, but July actually has a special meaning. Obviously, we know it's a month of the year. So when we use the fill handle on a value like this, it's going to do something a little bit differently by default. So I'll find the fill handle again, and I will drag over, and notice that instead of just copying July, July, July over and over again, it has actually created a series of the months of the year that come after July. So Excel recognized that July was a special keyword, and it created this series. Now notice also that we have this little option tag that appeared here, and what it's doing is asking you to verify that that's really what you wanted to do. Did you want to fill with a series, which is what it did, or did you want to just copy July over and over again? Because that's a possibility. You could also select to just copy the formatting to the cells that you were selecting, or fill in a series but don't take any formatting. And fill months, again, would be basically the same thing that it's already done. So you would just choose a different option if you did not want to fill with the series as it did here. We'll leave it as it is. Alrighty, so now we know we can select with the pointer, and we can also use the fill handle to copy data. And it will either copy it in a plain, straight copy, or it will copy it in a series. We can also use the pointer in Excel to move data. It's called the drag and drop pointer when we do that. I'm going to select this data in cell D3, the Excel workshop data, and this time I'm going to place the pointer on the border of the active cell, anywhere on the border. Notice when I place it on the side, I get this arrow with a block arrow with a four-headed arrow on the tip of it. Same thing on the bottom, anywhere on the top, even on this side that you can barely see it. I want to stay away when I'm trying to drag and drop. I do want to stay away from the fill handle, And I don't want to be using the selection pointer either. So we're going to make sure that we're touching one of the borders away from that lower right corner. And I'm going to drag cell D3 down to cell C6. So I'll get that pointer and then use my left mouse button and drag it down to C6. And I actually moved it from its original location to the new location. I can do that with a group of cells as well. So if I want to take this group A3 through A5, again, I can grab that border anywhere on the edge and drag it to a new location. Drag that grouping of cells to a new location. We'll take a look at one last thing before we move into looking at an actual worksheet and entering formulas and functions. One of the important things to know about when you are working in a worksheet is how to manipulate your columns and rows. And we talked already about changing the widths of columns and the heights of rows. But another important technique to know when working with columns and rows is how to insert and delete them. Now this data is really not anything of any value to anyone. It's just a hodgepodge of the data that we've been entering. But you can see that we have several columns with data in them, and we have several rows with data in them. Now, one of the things that I notice about this worksheet is that I've got two blank rows here, row 4 and 5. And if I want to eliminate having blank rows in my worksheet, I can do that by deleting those rows. First of all, let me do one row by itself. Row 7 is also blank. So if I right-click right on the 7, I place my mouse on the 7 and right-click there, again, I will get a shortcut menu, and one of the options in the shortcut menu is to delete. If I click that, since I have selected that whole row by right-clicking on the 7 itself, Excel knows that I want to delete the entire row. So when I click delete, that entire row is gone and everything below it has been pushed up one. Now if I want to delete more than one row, I can do that. I can start with 4 and drag down to select row 5. And again, as long as I'm touching the row numbers when I do the selection, the entire row all the way to the end of the worksheet is selected. And I can right click on either one of those and choose delete to get rid of that entire row. Now let's say I want to insert a row. When we insert a row, the row will be inserted above the row that we select. So if I want to insert a row between 1 and 2, I can right click on row 2, and that's going to insert a row above row 2. So when I choose insert, I'll now have a blank row above row 2. Actually it becomes row 2, and row 2 was pushed down to become row 3. And the same thing, let's say I want to delete that row. I'll right click on it and delete. Now I've been showing you how to do this using right click because I use that technique quite a bit, but you can do the same thing by using the cells group here on the home tab. For instance, if I want to do that same thing, insert a row, I can go to the cells group and choose insert, and I can either insert cells, and again, since I've selected the entire row, it's going to insert a whole row. Or I can insert sheet rows, which is the same thing in this case. And there I've got an entire row selected. Now let's say I just wanted to push a cell down and leave all of the cells around it the same. Let's say I want to push August down one cell. I can do the same thing. Now remember, I could right click on it, but I'm going to go back and show you how to do it on the tab. If I just click insert cells, I will get a little dialog box asking me, what do I want to do with the cells around it? Do I want to shift them down, or do I want to shift them right? So let's, if we choose shift the cells right, let's see what happens then. If I click OK, that means that I pushed everything over to the right. And So I've created that, that extra cell there. I'm going to undo that and do the same thing. I'll right click and insert cells. This time I'm going to say shift cells down, and if I click OK, that shifts everything, or that shifts August down, and anything below August in that same column would have been pushed down also. Let's see how that works for Excel workshop here. If I choose to insert a cell and shift cells down, and then everything gets shifted down one.